So a Tumblr post about quote-unquote off-model animation in Steven Universe kind of exploded in less than a day, getting a flood of agreeing notes. This made me realize that the entire online culture centered around mocking supposed animation fails is still pretty darn huge, and that the growing online animation fandom didn't really change the minds of that many people as far as intentionally loose artwork goes. Many people still have a fundamental problem discerning between controlled stylization and drawing mistakes and see it as mere laziness if a specific cartoon storyboarder brings their own art style to a project. Now, of course, there are legitimate criticisms for Steven Universe. Message delivery in some episodes can be pretty weird, and I definitely would prefer a look more similar to that of Rebecca Sugar's older work, but the fact that it allows its storyboarders to add their own stylistic touch to the episodes is one of the absolute best things about it. Sometimes the storyboarders will just think screw it and straight up draw a bunch of keyframes, going above and beyond the job they were supposed to do just to make sure the show will look as good as it possibly can given its constraints as a board-driven, Korea animated TV show. These issues with artistic misunderstanding go far beyond animation. You'll see a lot of the same statements being made about Western comic books or manga. One of the very first results you'll get from Google searching bad comic book art is from Eric Canet's obviously experienced and skillfully stylized Spider-Man issue. Many readers simply can't tell the difference between artists like Canet, whose work is purposefully distorted and who has a clear stylistic pedigree including other unfairly misunderstood artists like Peter Chung, and someone like Rob Liefeld who simply lacks drawing skill. The meme status of Rob Liefeld unfortunately resulted in many people who know very little about art feeling like they know exactly what makes a bad superhero drawing. Instead of taking into account the elements that show Liefeld's actual lack of skill, they assume that the over-the-top, hyper-exaggerated and deformed nature of his art is inherently bad, and thus they will treat such aesthetics as a mistake even in the hands of far better artists that actually know what they're doing. Truth is, Rob Liefeld's artwork gets torn apart even by those who are knowledgeable about drawing because it shows a lack of control and technical experience. Some forms of stylization, like Liefeld's, will only look right if the artist has a good understanding of anatomy and solid drawing. I'd explain what solid drawing means with my own words, but I feel that Ren and Stimpy's John Kricfalusi summarized the whole thing extremely well on his own blog, so I'll just quote him instead. Solid doesn't mean realistic, but a cartoonist who understands form, perspective, and balance has a huge advantage over unskilled cartoonists who have to rely on copying superficial aspects of other artists' work. A Liefeld drawing like this isn't bad because it's not realistic or because the proportions look silly. It's bad because all of the principles that John mentioned are clearly missing. The character is extremely off balance, the use of form is not believably three-dimensional, and the perspective on the leg is terrible. I feel the best way to explain exaggerated perspective with a visual example would be through this extremely interesting and deceivingly simple Flash script. It allows you to not only manipulate a three-dimensional cube, but also includes a perspective distortion bar. Even the most exaggerated use of perspective can be not merely technically proficient, but outright mathematically calculated. In this case, by an actual programmed computer script. This is not to say all art needs to follow these laws. Some artists' drawings are simply too highly stylized and abstract to be held back by real-world concepts of three-dimensional solidity. However, this does not mean there's absolutely no technique involved. Quite the opposite, you need to have a particularly good understanding of other, subtler principles like design, posing, line of action, negative space, etc. to make a comic as crazy as the work of Milt Gross work well. Liefeld's work, however, is clearly not intended to be even half as abstract or out there. So when a character's leg looks like a paper cutout in a composition that is otherwise clearly intended to look three-dimensional, it will look extremely wrong. Compare the Liefeld drawings to the supposedly horrible Spider-Man page from earlier, and it should start to become quite obvious why the latter looks much more purposeful and controlled. The bulging muscles, the very pointy shapes, the exaggeration of perspective perspective, everything is highly distorted, but it's distorted in an extremely consistent way. The artist also doesn't try to excuse himself from drawing complicated things like hands and feet, a typical Liefeld trademark. He does show that he understands how they anatomically work, he just distorts them a lot. People love to mock the "it's just my style" excuse that supposedly a lot of DeviantArt kids use, but sometimes it's not just a mindless excuse from a talentless hack at all. Sometimes it really is just the personal style of a very technically impressive artist, and your inability to notice the difference between purposeful deformation and drawing accidents will be obvious to someone with significant drawing experience. To them, you will look like the ignorant DeviantArt child. To get back to animation, there's a world of a difference between an episode director or a storyboarder being allowed to purposefully alter the style of a show during an episode they were assigned to, and someone just drawing a character wrong because they had to hurry, or they simply aren't very good at drawing. Gurren Lagann episode 4 might not be the most well animated one, but I feel that people criticize it for all the wrong reasons. The animation was rushed and often not very technically impressive, sure, but the main reason it's hated is the supposed ugliness of the characters, which is really obviously an intentional stylistic choice from Osamu Kobayashi, a man who's used the same style in many other projects. It was also thematically fitting. The director himself said the episode was meant to highlight the stupidity of the characters, and the ridiculous style enforced that extremely well. I agree that Kobayashi might not be the best shonen action mecha show director, and that he's far better at portraying everyday life scenes, albeit through a fully Cooley-esque, half melancholic, half zany, stylized manner. But I mean, some of the epic animation fails that people whined about were some of the only really well animated scenes in the entire episode, and that's just silly. It's true that many cartoons treat on-model drawing as absolutely obligatory and punish anyone who strays from the original designs. Many animators and storyboarders, however, consider this adherence to model sheets to be extremely artistically limiting. It's not a completely black and white issue. I personally prefer off-model looseness, but there are definitely cartoons out there that look extremely impressive despite taking a more conservative approach. Disney animation traditionally stresses the illusion of life. You're not meant to notice the hand of the animator, and individual artists shifting the models according to their personal aesthetic sense is usually a big no-no. But there are also plenty of cartoons made with the off-model is good philosophy that are amazing. There's nothing wrong with preferring on-model consistent animation or comic book art that's not heavily stylized. However, your own stylistic preference is not the objectively correct way to draw. If a film critic gave 0 stars to a romance movie just because it's a romance movie and he doesn't like romance movies, then he would get his ass fired in a moment. Far too many people feel that their opinions have to be objective criticisms. Sometimes it's completely fine to just say that something is not your cup of tea. A decent critic can separate technical achievement from personal stylistic preference. Technical criticism can be very important to the evolution of an artist, but not all artistic observation has to be technical criticism.